Everything we saw him do seemed to betray a huge enjoyment of life. He seemed to grasp from the beginning that life is one fast-moving train, and you have to jump aboard and hold on to your hat and relish the sweep of the wind as it rushes by. You have to enjoy the journey. It's unthankful not to. I think that's how his country remembers him, in his joy.
We're back now with our friends Peggy Noonan, the columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and Harvard University's David Gergen, both of whom worked for Ronald Reagan. David also worked, of course, for President Clinton. Now, Peggy, you were a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan. I know that presidents write every word of every speech, but that was a particularly eloquent thing there. Did you maybe help him draft it, work with him a little?
I worked with him on that. That was in 1985, June of '85. The President and Mrs. Reagan were very fond of Jackie Kennedy and her children, and they came to him personally and said, we're having a fundraiser for this library that we're starting. Could you help us? And the JFK library at that point had not been fully endowed. And the Reagans, Ronald and Nancy Reagan, thought, that's history. That's not partisan. That's not anything like that. Let's help them be a repository for history. So very graciously, the President and the First Lady went over to Ted Kennedy's house in McLean, Virginia, and spoke about the nature and personality and character of this man Ronald Reagan had politically opposed, and yet on a personal level was appreciating very deeply, and it was very touching. It was nice. It was like the old days where you could be nice to the other side.
I tell you, there is one kind of bipartisan thing in recent history, isn't there, David? And that is that every president wants to sort of be like Jack Kennedy in a way.
Absolutely. You know,
and borrow from him.
Absolutely. After Lincoln died, historians wrote that every president wanted to get right with Lincoln. Yeah. They wanted to walk in his footsteps and be in the mantle of Lincoln. And that happened after John F. Kennedy. Yeah. You know, Larry Sabatow's book, you just had him on as a guest here, is very much about every president drew upon Kennedy, especially Bill Clinton. You know, remember that famous scene when Kennedy was young, came to the White House, and he sort of reached out and touched the hand of God. And he was always influenced by it and drew heavily upon it in his rhetoric and in his actions.
What do you, I'd like just the same question to both of you. What do you think this anniversary means for the country? I think it's very important for people who were not alive when this happened to understand as much as they can about this.
Sure.
What is it that you find most important, Peggy?
Well, it is the 50th anniversary. This may be the last time we remember this shattering historical event. The last time we remember it on this level. You know, the 60th and 70th won't be like this, and so many people who can talk about it will have left. Look, this was a moment that for two generations of Americans was quite something that entered their minds and their imaginations forever. For the baby boomers of America, the biggest generation in U.S. history, they watched it live on this new thing called TV. I was a baby boomer. I can remember when we got our first TV, just about 1959. So it was just amazing to have this shattering event, enter your living room and to enter your head. For our parents, the greatest generation, Jack Kennedy's generation, it was losing one of their own, one who'd fought World War II with them, and they thought very much as Mary McCrory, whom you knew, once had a conversation with Pat Moynihan in which Mary, waiting online to see John Kennedy's casket at the Capitol, she looked at Pat Moynihan and she said, "What are we doing at Jack Kennedy's funeral? I can't believe it. We will never laugh again." And Pat Moynihan said, "We'll laugh again, but we'll never be young again." And so that was another generation that was just hit by this historical event.
Yeah, you said last night on the special, Bob, that it was a loss of innocence. And I think that captures it absolutely right. For so many people, America seemed to be at peace with the world. We were prospering. We had this sort of sense that we could go anywhere and do anything. And we had then entered, that was the dawn of a new age. It was a tumultuous period that followed. There was a real sense, you know, we often quoted Yeats in the 60s and 70s about things fall apart. The center cannot hold. It was from Jesus, his poem, the second coming after the World War I. There was also something, I think we were robbed of a sense of the future. It was very different from the Lincoln assassination, when there was equal amount of grief, but there was a sense when Lincoln died that his work was completed by April of 1865. The war was basically over. Whereas with Kennedy, it was just beginning. And there was a sense that somehow this silly little communist, as Jackie Kennedy called him, had stolen our future.
Yeah.
You know, Lucy Johnson, when I talked to her, and she said, and I was talking to her after we did the part on camera, she said over and over her father kept saying, I've got to show them. We've got to show them. They killed our president, but they haven't killed our country. Everything he did, Lyndon Johnson was concerned about how it would be viewed by Khrushchev and the Soviets, because they didn't know at that point what this was all about. And I think while it was one of the most tragic periods in our history, it was also a time that we can all be proud of, because when Lyndon Johnson stepped off that airplane, he was in command, and the President of the United States had been shot, but there was another president there, and the Constitution once again had held.
Yeah, we had to prove we had it all together, and he did. LBJ understood not only is the world watching, American young people are watching. People are anxious. We hadn't been through a moment like this in a very, very long time, and he knew that the strength of the system, the continuity of the presidency, the seamless continuity of our politics, everybody must be reminded that continues. We're going to grieve, we're going to mark this tragedy, but nothing changes here. America goes on.
David, why do you think so many people still cannot accept the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone?
Well, I think that the shooting really opened this new age of skepticism, too, and we're very doubtful of what we're told by public authorities. Of course, that's gotten much worse in recent years, and as we're going through a particularly acute period of that right now. I think that the fact that Jack Ruby got in there and was able to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald so easily, we forget. You were here, Bob. You know, you understood the Dallas-Fort Worth culture. For the country to see Ruby get in there and do that, it was as if he's trying to silence him, and I think that made a big
It's very hard for people to understand now that that's just sort of how it was in those days. Basically, if you look like you belong someplace, you could get in. That's why I always wore a snap brim hat as a police reporter for the Star-Telegram. If people wanted to assume I was a detective, we let them assume that. and you could do that in those days. Well, I want to thank both of you so much.
I want to say one last thing, Bob. I just, a poll 3 years ago asked Americans, who do you think, if there was any president put on Mount Rushmore, who should it be? 50 years later, it's Jack Kennedy, #1.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And
It was a privilege to be here.
Yes, it was.
I'll have some final thoughts in a minute.